From NBC News in Washington, the world's longest-running television program, this is Meet the Press with David Gregory.
Good Sunday morning. A live picture this morning from the Olympic compound in Sochi, Russia, on the final day of these Olympic Winter Games that will be known not only for the drama of the athletic competition and the warm weather in Sochi, but also for the revolt in neighboring Ukraine. There is breaking news this morning as protesters continue to pack Independence Square in the capital of Kiev. The whereabouts of President Viktor Yanukovych are unknown. The bloody crackdown has left dozens dead. Ukraine's parliament voted to remove Yanukovych from power. On Ukrainian television Saturday, Yanukovych said he would not step down. The battle for Ukraine underlines the tension between Russia and the United States of late that some believe harkens back to the Cold War. And as the Ukraine story moves so quickly, I'm joined now by the President's National Security Advisor, Susan Rice. Good to have you. Welcome back to Meet the Press.
Good to be with you, David.
Ambassador, what is the latest? Where is Yanukovych? Are you worried that this is a situation teetering towards civil war?
Well, David, Yanukovych's whereabouts, as you said, are not known at the present. What we do know is that he picked up in a very orderly fashion and left the capital, Kiev, just after having signed an agreement that was designed to lead to a unity government. From the U.S. point of view, our interests have been clear all along. We want to see a de-escalation of the violence. We want to see constitutional change. We want to see democratic elections in very short order, and the opportunity for the people of Ukraine to come together in a coalition unity government.
Is the United States on the side of the protesters? The
United States is on the side of the Ukrainian people. And the Ukrainian people have indicated from the outset, 3 months ago when this began, that President Yanukovych at the time, his decision to turn away from Europe was not the choice of the Ukrainian people. The Ukrainian people expressed themselves peacefully. They were met with violence. And that did not end well for Yanukovych.
Does he have to go, in the president's mind?
He has gone.
But does he have to relinquish power?
He has gone, David. I mean, this is an interesting and complicated situation, as you know. Yanukovych has lost enormous legitimacy, despite having been originally democratically elected, by turning on his people, by using violence in the streets against peaceful protesters, and by flouting the will of the Ukrainian
But
people.
he's saying he's not stepping down.
But he left Kiev, packed up in an orderly fashion, took his stuff, his furniture with him. This was not fleeing in a very disorderly fashion. So now he is in a place that will reveal itself. Yesterday we know where he was. Today we're not so sure. But the fact is he's not leading at the present.
In foreign affairs, as in other things, location matters, right? Location, location, location. That's why I want to show for our viewers the map, because I think it's so instructive. Ukraine's a huge country, 46 million people, but look where it is. It's on the doorstep of Russia, and that certainly matters to Russian President Vladimir Putin, who very much views Ukraine within his sphere of influence. Half the country, big east-west divide there, half the country to the east, millions of them speak Russian, identify with Russia. The president spoke with President Putin. Was his message pointedly, back off here, let Ukraine follow its own course?
The president's message was, look, we have a shared interest in a Ukraine that remains unified, whole, independent, and is able to exercise the will of its people freely. At that point, Putin was in agreement. They were both able to say that they wanted to see the implementation of the agreement that had been signed on Friday. And that agreement is very consistent with our principles, and it's consistent, in fact, David, with where this situation is going. We are going to have a unity government. We are going to have near-term elections. We are going to have constitutional reform. And that reflects the will of the Ukrainian people and the interests of the United States and Europe.
But Putin is viewed widely, as The Economist put it, he's viewed as the architect of this bloody crackdown. Do you not fear that this could take an ominous turn, that Russia, particularly after these Olympic Games, could decide perhaps to send forces in to restore the kind of government that Russia would like to see? After all, it was Putin who guaranteed $15 billion worth of loans to Yanukovych so that they would reject the West, reject the European Union.
That would be a grave mistake. It's not in the interests of Ukraine or of Russia or of Europe or the United States to see the country split. It's in nobody's interest to see violence return and the situation escalate. There is not an inherent contradiction, David, between a Ukraine that has long-standing historic and cultural ties to Russia and a modern Ukraine that wants to integrate more closely with Europe. These need not be mutually exclusive.
But isn't it interesting that I've heard the president say, look, we don't want to look at this like the Cold War. But isn't that how Vladimir Putin views all of this? Doesn't he look at this sphere of influence very much in a Cold War context?
He may, but if he does, that's a pretty dated perspective that doesn't reflect where the people of Ukraine are coming from. This is not about the U.S. and Russia. This is about whether the people of Ukraine have the opportunity to fulfill their aspirations and be democratic and be part of Europe, which they choose to be.
Is this a good thing? As you see this kind of ferment, 3 years ago, the Arab Spring in Egypt, you see this democratic ferment in Ukraine, we're seeing it in Venezuela and other places. Does President Obama view this as a positive sign?
No, democracy is a good thing, David. Sometimes the making of it is very messy. There can be setbacks, it can be uneven, but we all know through many examples in history that democracies are more stable, they protect their people, they're more peaceful, they're more able to deliver economic opportunity to their people. So over time, this trajectory is a good one.
And yet, as Americans are paying attention to this, I talk to people, they may not understand all the complications of Ukraine and the split toward, the European Union versus Russia. But what they do see is they see Vladimir Putin trying to shore up a sphere of influence. They see the Russians releasing this tape of art diplomat Victoria Nuland talking about, the opposition and the political future of Ukraine. They see Russia talking about the U.S. meddling in its area, giving political asylum to Edward Snowden, blocking the United States when it comes to interests in Syria. Why shouldn't Americans look at Vladimir Putin and Russia today as an enemy?
David, first of all, we have to be very pragmatic, and President Obama has been exceedingly pragmatic about our dealings with Russia. There are areas where we can cooperate with them. There are areas where we disagree bitterly with them. But let's look at both sides of the ledger. We have been able to reach a new and very important arms control agreement with them, the New START Treaty. We've been able to cooperate on Afghanistan, and Russia's role in enabling us to move our equipment and personnel in and out of Afghanistan has been very important. On Iran, we've actually been working together on the effort to use diplomacy to see if we can't obtain a nuclear agreement. They've been cooperative in that. On the other hand, we differ bitterly over issues of human rights. We differ over Syria. We differ over their treatment of LGBT persons. And we differ over a number of issues. And the fact of the matter is, we should cooperate where we can. Where we can't agree and where we don't agree, we should be very plain about that and stand up for our interests, which we do.
Don't you understand that perspective of Americans who may not be in the foreign policy establishment, who say, when is enough enough? I mean, when do you confront Putin at some point and call him on all this
we
stuff?
have confronted him, and we do call him on it, and the president is very plain and very forceful in his dealings with Putin. But it's not necessary, nor is it our interest, to return to a Cold War construct, which is long out of date and that doesn't reflect the realities of the 21st century.
I mentioned one of the areas where the Russians have been so unhelpful, and Secretary of State John Kerry was really forceful in his criticism of Russia this past week, is about Syria. This is how President Obama described Syria just a couple of weeks ago on the situation there.
We still have a horrendous situation on the ground in Syria. The state of Syria itself is crumbling. That is bad for Syria. It is bad for the region. It is bad for global national security.
And yet this deterioration that the president describes follows the president issuing a red line for Syria over chemical weapons and then stepping back from that. Now you have the horrendous situation he describes. Assad is stronger with Russia's help. Al-Qaeda and other jihadis are present in Syria in an incredibly ominous way. And 95.5% of the most dangerous chemical weapons remain in that country. Isn't it time for a new U.S. strategy?
Well, David, look, nobody is content with the situation in Syria. From a humanitarian point of view, it's horrific. From a national security point of view, it's deteriorating. There's no question. We're constantly reviewing our options. We're constantly looking at ways to accomplish our objective. And let me be clear about what that objective is. First of all, we don't want to see terrorists and the terrorist threat emanate from Syria. We're concerned about the growing extremist presence there. We believe it's critical that Assad leave power and that there be be a transitional government formed by mutual consent, and that the institutions of the Syrian state remain intact. We don't want to see the state fragment, which is why, David, it's important to understand this. I think folks need to understand, which is why we have tried to pursue a diplomatic resolution, not because we're naive and we think that, that there isn't a real hot war on the ground, but at the end of the day, unless and until there's a political solution, this thing is not going to be resolved. It's not going to be resolved on the battlefield. So we've been pursuing multiple...
But you say that you met with intelligence chiefs from the region, the Saudis and others, who want more lethal aid provided to the rebels to tip the balance and actually take Assad out. Is the U.S. prepared to escalate on the ground to achieve a different result on the battlefield?
Well, the United States is actively supporting the moderate opposition with material support, with political support, and that support is increasing, David, and we're doing it in consultation and coordination with countries in the region. We're also the largest supplier of humanitarian assistance, and yesterday, because of U.S. leadership and that of other partners, we were able for the first time to get a resolution in the United Nations Security Council that binds the Syrian government to allow humanitarian assistance in.
And you talk about the humanitarian assistance. The level of suffering is huge. The fact that Assad has killed, about 1 million people have died, the refugee crisis adding numbers to that by almost another 1 million. I mean, the scale of mass suffering is huge in
David,
Syria.
I think it's more like 100,000, which is
I misspoke.
horrific.
I'm sorry. Yeah, 100,000 killed. Excuse me, I was speaking about the refugee number. I apologize. But the scale of mass suffering is huge. Senator McCain has said that future presidents will apologize for what the U.S. has failed to do now. You've been asked in the past about mass suffering, genocide in Rwanda, and President Clinton's admitted failure to intervene. And you worked on those issues. And this is what you told The Atlantic back in September of 2001. I swore to myself that if I ever faced such a crisis again, I would come down on the side of dramatic action, going down in flames if that was required. How does that view influence the advice you give to the president on Syria?
Well, first of all, David, this is not a genocide. It's a horrific civil war that has spilled over and infused the neighboring states. It's one that we have worked very hard to end through support to the opposition, through humanitarian assistance, through active and aggressive diplomacy. And David, we have every interest in trying to bring this conflict to a conclusion. But if the alternative here is to intervene with American boots on the ground, as some have argued, I think that the judgment the United States has made and the President of the United States has made is that is not in the United States' interest. We are very much committed to trying to work to resolve this conflict, but in a way that doesn't insert the United States back into a hot, bloody conflict in the middle of the Middle East.
This is a complicated time for the world, as you know better than anybody. If you think about democratic ferment around the globe, you think about American retrenchment from Afghanistan and Iraq, sectarian division in Syria and Iraq. And there's been some criticism of President Obama about just what his view of the world is in his foreign policy. He wrote this in Audacity of Hope. He wrote, without a well-articulated strategy that the public supports and the world understands, America will lack the legitimacy and ultimately the power it needs to make the world safer than it is today. What is that view of the world that President Obama has that he seeks legitimacy for?
President Obama views the United States as the leading and most important global power because of the power of our economy, the power of our values, the power of our military. We are and will remain the most important country in the world. And without our leadership, which we exercise every day actively from Africa to the Middle East to Asia, the world would not be nearly as stable and as prosperous as it is. Now, it is complicated, as you said. There's setbacks and there difficult circumstances. But, David, look what the United States is doing around the world. We're actively working to try to bring a negotiated resolution, finally, to the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. And as difficult and fraught as that is, we're making progress. Because of the United States leadership, we have the prospect of resolving the Iranian nuclear program through diplomacy. We don't know that it will succeed, but we're closer to that goal than we have ever been.
You don't worry about a potential for stalemate, as you already hear the Iranians say that the idea of removing missiles is off the table?
David, there's always a potential that this doesn't succeed, but we have already halted the progress of the Iranian nuclear program and begun to roll it back in critical ways. For 6 months, this program will be set back, and the timelines for them to achieve any kind of breakout have been expanded. In the meanwhile, we have the potential to explore a comprehensive, peaceful resolution to the Iranian nuclear program. That is not something that we could say 6 months ago, and it is very substantially a product of American diplomacy. And it's indicative of the way we have approached conflicts around the world, where we are actively involved in trying to resolve them, from Africa to Asia to the Middle East.
When you were last here, Ambassador Rice, it was an eventful morning on the story of Benghazi and the horrible attack on our compound there. We haven't seen you in a while. As you look back at your involvement in all of that, do you have any regrets?
David, no, because what I said to you that morning and what I did in every day since was to share the best information that we had at the time. The information I provided, which I explained to you, was what we had at the moment. It could change. I commented that this was based on what we knew on that morning, was provided to me and my colleagues, and indeed to Congress, by the intelligence community. And that's been well validated in many different ways since. And that information turned out in some respects not to be 100% correct. But the notion that somehow I or anybody else in the administration misled the American people is patently false. And I think that that's been amply demonstrated. The
politics of this are still intense. Do you believe it cost you the Secretary of State job?
David, I don't know. What I do know is that I have a great job. It's the greatest honor in the world to work for the President of the United States and on behalf of the American people, and I couldn't ask for anything more.
We know, as was said at that time, and has been found later, that security at the compound was a gaping deficiency. But it's also an issue of finding the people responsible for this attack. The President spoke forcefully about that during the presidential debates. This is what he said in October of 2012.
We are going to find out who did this, and we're going to hunt them down. Because one of the things that I've said throughout my presidency is, when folks mess with Americans, we go after them.
17 months later, are we any closer to finding who is responsible? Yes,
I think you've heard the Attorney General speak to this. The investigation is ongoing, and it is indeed made progress. But the point is, we will get the perpetrators. And if we will stay on it until this gets done. And if you need any proof of that, recall the capture operation that occurred not long ago in Libya against somebody who attacked the United States many years ago in Africa. The United States stays on the case. This president, our President Obama, has said that we will do what it takes to bring the perpetrators to justice, and indeed we will.
Finally, I just want to, on a final point about Ukraine and what you will be monitoring and watching for today and in the days to come.
Well, most importantly, David, we want to obviously see a de-escalation of the violence. And for the last few days, things have been much more peaceful. That is welcome, and it's something we want to see sustained. The Parliament is actively involved now in choosing this transitional government, setting the date for elections, and appointing acting heads of ministries. We want to shore that up. And very importantly, we want to cooperate with partners in Europe, the IMF, the Russians, if they're prepared to participate, to help the Ukrainian economy, which is very, very fragile. They need to reform, and they